Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everybody to our webinar today. I would like to start off by introducing our speaker today. Zahra Rahman is a high school teacher and learning specialist in Brooklyn, New York. She completed her Bachelor in Science in both English and Biology and her Master's in Anatomical Sciences from the George Washington University. Her studies focused on disability studies and how trauma affects the adolescent brain. Zahra worked for the Fairfax County Domestic and Sexual Violence Center for 7 years as a crisis line volunteer and worked closely with the county as a crisis line specialist, focusing on community outreach. Zahra has been in the field of education for the last 3 years with a focus on working with students with learning and behavioral disabilities. Zahra utilizes evidence-based approaches to provide her students with educational equity and accessibility. In addition to her work as a teacher, Zahra's aim is to be conscious of the diversity of her student population, especially when it comes to trauma and how it affects the learning brain. Her aim is to educate her community and promote positive mental health by starting off with the youth. Outside of the work setting, Zahra has worked with and educated herself across many different countries and communities to begin an interfaith dialogue. Her long-term goals include promoting education about domestic violence and sexual violence to Muslim families, providing a safe space for adolescents across diverse communities, and serving inner city communities with equity and mental health accessibility. Welcome, Zahra. And before I begin, I just would like to share a few things about Peaceful Families Project. We're a national nonprofit. We provide education training for leaders, community members, and service providers about domestic violence awareness, healthy relationships, and culture and competency. We do resource development. You can find a lot of resources on our website and research and technical assistance. And the purpose of today's webinar is to provide a space for adolescents and young adults to speak their truth and bring to light their pain, struggles, and joy. The long-term goal, though, is to introduce a new monthly space to give young people the opportunity to unload, breathe, and be part of a community of other youth who have experienced domestic violence in the home. Welcome, Zahra, and I'm going to hand it to you right now.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. I think we had someone come in. Malahat, is that how you say your name?
Assalamu alaikum. Yes,
Wa
it
alaikum
is.
salam.
How are you?
Good, alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. Thank you so much.
Good. I am just going to share my screen. Right now, we're a very intimate group, which is great. So hopefully it can benefit you and we can kind of have an open-ended discussion in whatever you want to hear. Okay, Malahat? Okay, so the title of this webinar is Finding Peace Amidst the Chaos. And it's a place for community and healing. I'm a teacher, so I believe in a lot of community and healing in a space that doesn't always seem that way. For me, the biggest aim is a lot of times when we're speaking about domestic violence or we're talking about sexual violence, we don't really think about the effects of domestic violence in the home on the young people that are there. And this translates into adulthood and the way that they process their own emotions, the way that they process their own belonging and their sense of being in the world. And so for me, the biggest aim is just to work towards building this sort of understanding and respect for the youth in our community. So again, Sister Hasna went through this a little bit already about Peaceful Families. It's a national nonprofit. Our goal is to educate and train our community members in order to spread a little more awareness about domestic violence within Muslim communities. A little bit about me. Again, Sister Hasna already talked about my role as a high school teacher and learning specialist. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. I'm passionate about intersection of education and mental health because I believe that we can't learn if we're not mentally there and well, and we're not using our brain the way that we want to. And so for over the 8 last years, I've had different experiences within domestic and sexual violence. In college, I spent a lot of time within our organizations there. And then after that, I was a hotline volunteer, a court accompaniment. So I went to take victims of domestic violence if they wanted restraining orders, and I worked in hospital accompaniment. So if a person was sexually assaulted and they didn't have someone to go to the hospital with them in order to get their checkup done, I would go with them. So I guess just our purpose right here is to introduce ourselves, acknowledge how witnessing domestic violence changes the way that the child brain processes information, and provide a space to discuss and unload trauma, and explore tools to support our youth, focusing on identifying trauma and a response plan. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll have a little bit of an idea of how to build a toolkit in order to not only serve yourself, but serve the community around us. Just a few things to note. And again, we're a small group, but just if you're watching this at home at a later time, to whenever you are talking about domestic violence, if you're in a group, especially with young people, treat them with dignity and respect. Don't be quick to judge anything that they have to say. Listen and just help them feel seen, and use these tools in order just to establish communication. Again, if you're watching at home or if you're here, just a trigger warning. We will address a few things that aren't, a normal conversation. And so if you feel any experience or anything that are coming up for you, just please take a step back and take care of yourself. Acknowledge your feelings, and your feelings are valid. You can mute the webinar. And if you're watching this later on, maybe watch it in chunks, and reach out to someone you trust. Sharing that communication and how you're feeling is really important. And do a few grounding exercises, breathe, acknowledge your presence, and then leave the webinar if you do not feel comfortable to be present. So I'm just going to start off with this. Malahat, I know it's you here, and I think Sister Salma joined. But even if you're watching at home, take a few minutes and kind of establish an intentionality of why you're here, and describe who you are, identify who you are. Think about why you're watching this, even if you didn't come on Sunday. Why do you feel the need to watch this webinar? And then think of qualities and perspectives that you have within yourself that make you a great member of society. So Malahat, I'm gonna ask you, do you feel comfortable sharing any three of these or all of these?
Assalamu alaikum, Salma. It's good to be here. So I'm actually a psychotherapist, and I work with the Muslim community, and my specialization is in trauma and domestic violence. I don't work with kids specifically, but I work with families, and within that context, certainly dealing with women attempting to make choices about their children's health and well-being. So I'm here because I am happy to support Peaceful Families, and always open to learning more and growing. And and so working with not only the Muslim community, but a lot of international communities. I work for an international organization, and so women make different choices about, they make different decisions when they're in a domestic abuse situation. So I think the adverse childhood experiences and understanding how domestic violence affects their children can be an important part of helping them be informed so they can make good choices, and not kind of based on what maybe some of the myths are, that sometimes staying together can be better for the children if there's ongoing abuse. So I always struggle with those types of situations, but really hoping to just learn from you about what you're doing, and hope to apply some of that in my own work. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Sister Selma, do you want to share anything?
I'm sorry, I have like background noise, so I'm going to be muted. I'm just really glad that you're doing this, Zahra. Looking forward to doing more of this programming that will include youth and reach out.
Inshallah. Thank you.
I have a very young youth listening to you. My granddaughter, 6 months, is why I'm going to be on mute. She's listening.
Okay, great. I want to start off this webinar with a little bit of an activity. The purpose of this activity is to help us understand the complexity of an abusive relationship and how many different lives are affected within it. And so I'm actually going to share my screen with this specific scenario. So I'm going to present the scenario. We can either take turns reading, or I can just put this up on the screen and you can read, and I will give you maybe like 5 minutes and I'll scroll down. And so everybody at home, you can kind of watch this and look at this document at your own time. But what we're gonna do is just different things that you notice and wonder. So we're reading about 2 siblings and how they're affected by domestic violence in 2 different ways. And one is an older sibling, one is a younger sibling. They're still processing emotions in their world and their sense of belonging in different ways. And so when you're reading through this, afterwards, I'm going to ask you about a few noticings that you noticed, for lack of a better word, during the reading. And then what did you wonder? What more did you want to know? Did you want to know less about something? Does that make sense, Malahat?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
So I am just going to put this here and then maybe scroll down in like 2 minutes so you can read the rest of it, okay? maybe take another minute to finish reading, and then we'll discuss the scenario. Okay, was that enough time to read?
That's perfectly fine. Yes, thank you.
Great. So what we're gonna do now is just kind of discuss what you noticed and what you were wondering. And if you're watching this webinar later on, the recording of this, maybe do this for yourself. Take a few minutes before you actually watch this, maybe pause the video and write down your noticings and wonderings, and then come back to the video and kind of see what we came up with. So anything that you noticed and wondered, right? There was a lot going on in the scenario. Did you want to share anything, Malahat?
Sure. I just noticed that, you know, each of the children are at different developmental ages, so that the situation may be impacting them differently. I also noticed that there were different types of abuse at home. Sounds like there was some emotional, verbal, psychological abuse, and there was an incident of physical abuse. So they've been exposed to different forms of abuse. I noticed that their responses were different as well. That Ali had a bit of a hyper arousal, but then also like a hypo arousal response. So he was startled, but he's also kind of freezing. And Susie has developed these perfectionist tendencies. And so, yeah, so in terms of wondering, I guess I'm wondering about, you know, the trauma that they've experienced and how that's already manifesting in their day-to-day, and how that will ultimately affect them in the long run if it's not treated, if it's not addressed. And will things get worse at home? Right?
Yep. Yeah, I think the wonderings that you have acknowledged are really, really important, because, you know, every child is different, you know, and the way that they process things are different. So it's hard to textbook define children, right? Because they're developing, but they're also kind of, you know, taking in and absorbing a bunch of things in their surroundings. So the way that they, you know, that's their normal at home, and that's like what they see and what they experience. They don't know anything else. And so it is, you know, that's something that when I think about children and how they are experiencing trauma, I definitely look at this second bullet: how will the trauma leak into their like developmental, through their developmental ages, I'd rather say. Okay, great. So I think that's a solid list, and it, you know, kind of definitely takes us through what the rest of the webinar is going to be about. So ideally with the children that I work with teenagers. And so we do a lot of restorative circles, and I love restorative circles because it is an uncomfortable space to be in, Sitting in a circle is not a normal thing that people do when they have conversations. You know, people are generally facing each other, or they're, you know, kind of relaxed and sitting with people that they know. Restorative circles brings a lot of people from different backgrounds together in order to heal in this space. And it forces you to look at every single person in the circle. I remember when I first started teaching, I found these circles to be very, very uncomfortable. And just, I was like, this isn't a normal way to address someone. It's not a normal way to, like, you know, deal with the different things. But as I started practicing them more, it has the root of restorative justice is in the criminal justice system. And it emphasizes the harm that has been done and repairing it from the inside and building a relationship rather than punishing the offender. So it really stems from like a place of healing. And I think when you have a full conversation and kind of let the discomfort exist within teenagers as well, it's really great just to have this space for them to just say whatever they want and just listen to them. And especially when there is an altercation, or if there is some sort of, you know, resentment that children have, these work really great because they can find the healing within themselves and find a new way to frame the way that they view a relationship. So for example, with Ali and Susie, if they grew up and they had some sort of resentment with their father, but their father was trying to change and acknowledged his mistakes and everything, there would be an open communication between them and their father, with their mother present, and kind of just laying out everything that's happened and trying to, you know, reframe and reformat that relationship as well. So whenever I go through circles, I usually start off very light and just, you know, kind of talk about day-to-day things that aren't very deep or will kind of incite some sort of emotion within a child. So we kind of like start setting the ground. And, you know, if you're watching at home, you have kids, maybe try these questions with them, especially if you feel like they're going through some sort of trauma or some sort of, you know, mental health issue. A lot of times it really kind of builds that foundation of how children communicate, and just like kind of, you know, disarming them with all of the stuff and the angst that they hold, especially. So I would just like you to try some of these questions. I usually do a few rounds, and then the last few rounds get into the heavy stuff. So the first question is, are you a sunrise, daylight, twilight, or a night person? And then please share why you picked your time of day. So me personally, I'm a sunrise person. I like being awake in the morning before anybody. I think it's just like a very peaceful time. I love breakfast. So I feel like me kind of making breakfast and making my tea in the morning is very therapeutic for me. Malahat or Sister Selma, I know you have background noise, but if you want to share, please feel free to share.
Well, I was just nodding when you were talking because I'm also a sunrise person. My tea in the morning is like a very, it's something I look forward to, just having that time. I generally like to be up before everybody.
Yeah.
I'm also a sunset person. Like I love the sunset. You know, that can say something about you too, but
Yeah.
the sunrise is like you have a new day and there's like new hope and new opportunities. And then just the beauty of the sunset and just the beauty of nature is something that's therapeutic for me.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that. I'm a night person, so I'm actually very much more at peace when the day is ending and it's time to kind of shut down and tune off. I think that part of it is that I work in crisis, and so the day ends up being a lot of pain for so many people. And for me, I guess trying to keep people safe, and so I can hopefully by the end of the day kind of shut down and be in a more peaceful place. And having helped and maybe created some safety for some folks.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this question kind of, if we were in a space with children, I think it kind of gives you an idea as like a moderator or a mediator of like where everybody's coming from, right? Like the three of us shared very like distinct ways of why we picked the time of day, and we're all here for the same reason, and we're all here to kind of learn from each other. But even in that, the way that we process different times of days, it differs, and it kind of gives you an idea, a little idea of like a person's personality with just one question, which is really great if you're kind of leading a circle and you have like 15 kids around you, and they're all kind of like different energies, and some may be like very extroverted and just like to be the center of attention, and some of them may be a little quiet. And so it's just like a really great way to kind of see where they're coming from. This next question I think leads into like what is most important to them in life. And so if you could sit on a bench in a beautiful woods, who would you like sitting next to you on the bench and why? And this is kind of, I get questions like, oh, do they have to be alive? I said, no, like it could be anybody. Who would you want there with you? Me personally, I would want my grandmother or my mom. My grandmother passed away earlier this year, but those two people in my life very much like we can just sit in silence, or we could sit talking to each other about anything, and it is a very comfortable place to be. So that's me personally what I would do.
I can share that I would say exactly the same as you, Zahra, is my grandmother who passed away a little after I was married, and then more recently my mom in this last year. And yeah, I mean, I think they've always given me a sense of peace and calm and love and support, and yeah, and I miss them, so definitely.
Yeah, I definitely feel that.
Well, I'll chime in, and I was just telling my granddaughter that I would love to sit on the bench with her.
Oh,
At least she'll still sit right now, and
yeah.
soon she'll be running off.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, somebody that you just enjoy.
Yeah.
And you just enjoy being in their presence and company, and that person's company, you know, brings you a sense of peace as well.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's definitely like, I think this question kind of lays out like who are they most comfortable in their life with, you know, and shaping that, I think you get an idea of like who's the biggest support for the child. And, you know, even for us talking right now, you know, we have our supports, or someone we feel comfortable with, or someone that we feel at ease with, which is really, really important to kind of just like hear the kids out, see what they're doing. And this is also a very real moment, right? Like there are so many times where we just sit with people, we either talk to people. I had this moment last week. It was kind of like all abruptly where I went to one of my boys who graduated. He had a bunch of my containers, and I was like, I'm running out of Tupperware. Like, I need my containers back. So I drove, and it was like a very rainy day. And he just comes, sits in the car. We sit for an hour, and it felt like 5 minutes. And it was just a very nice moment of just like, we were both kind of very tired. He was frustrated about a few things, and we just sat and talked for an hour. So it definitely is a very real moment with kids, especially where, you know, you kind of have to hold on to these moments where they actually want to talk. And then this one is kind of getting into more of like the emotional state, right? And more addressing like what difficulties a child has gone through, what traumas might come up for them. So whenever I get to questions like this, I'm like, okay, just like take a few breaths. And I'm asking you a question about a difficult experience out of which you discovered a gift in your life, where it's still a difficult experience, but it's reframing it in a positive way. And hopefully, you know, when we get more youth to join, I want every single hardship to kind of like have a positive reframing, because you can't really change the past, but you know, that's why people become the way they are, is because of the things that they've been through in their life. And so this kind of reframes it. And I'm just like, you know, I'm going to open the space up. If anybody wants to share, you can share. But if you don't want to share, that's also okay. And just allowing for that validation that if you're here and you don't want to talk about your difficult stuff and you just want to listen, that's absolutely fine as well. So I'll start and, you know, just model what it looks like. And so a difficult experience out of which I discovered a gift in my life. In college, I had a friend who committed suicide. And that was a really difficult experience for me just to go through, because I, you know, had no idea that she was going through something. And throughout that, it was a very difficult time because my grandfather passed away like a week after. And when I think of like a time in my life where like a lot of experiences were condensed into one, I think I definitely learned a protective part of myself as well, where there is a part of me that like wants to ease the hardships of others, or even be there, because I kind of went into taking care of mode, which I'm still learning to kind of manage and balance that in my life. But it also taught me like a lot of gifts and that I have, and like a lot of strengths that I have within myself to get through hardships. So if you'd like to share anything, I'm just going to stay quiet for a few seconds and you can chime in if you want.
I can chime in. There was a situation I was going through in which I was really afraid that like people were really going to judge me. Mm-hmm. And I was really nervous about people finding out. And what surprised me is how many people actually didn't judge and showed up in a really compassionate way. So it, like, sometimes we worry that like we can't share certain things with people. And I'm not going to give the details because this is recorded, and it involves, you know, other people, specific people. But the lesson was just that sometimes you're so sure that, you know, you'll be judged and people won't support you. And actually what I've discovered over and over again is that so many people have gone through difficult situations that there are always people who won't judge and who will show up in a caring and empathetic way. Mm-hmm. So I learned that, you know, like it's okay to talk about things, and one person might judge you, but another person might not, and that's a gift.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And again, I feel like a question like this kind of starts opening those layers without, you know, kind of piercing at them. And it also allows for space to kind of see like how the kids are feeling, read the energies in the room, and kind of think about who shared, who didn't share, and how they may feel in that moment, and just kind of like read the room and how they're feeling at that specific moment. This I'm gonna skip just for the sake of time. This is something, again, it's the same sort of idea where it's very open-ended, so they can answer however they want. I've gotten kids saying, you know, I'm scared of spiders, like everything from spiders to, and how they deal with it. They're like, I don't deal with it. I just stay away from spiders. And then there are kids that are like, I'm scared to be alone, or I'm scared to be isolated. I'm scared that like no one's gonna love me in the future. And all of those things are very, very real. And so depending on like how vulnerable a child wants to be at a specific moment, you know, this allows for them to say that they're either scared of spiders, they're scared of the dark, they're scared of heights, or very deep things that are very personal in their life. So this last round kind of gets into like, you know, the domestic violence sort of things, and more specifically just like asking outright. And this is, again, an open-ended question, so that is not actually targeting a child's experience if they don't feel like sharing it. But this is when you hear or see the term domestic violence, what comes up for you? And this kind of allows the space to transition into kind of more of like explaining what domestic violence is, how it affects child development and all of that, and but also allows for us to hear a child's perspective on domestic violence. So again, I'll start. So when I hear or see the term domestic violence, I definitely start feeling a little frustrated and a little angry, just because I feel like there's so much work to be done. And then it kind of brings up feelings about, you know, how could someone hurt another person? And, you know, like, how can we help and all of this stuff? So there's kind of a balance of like feeling motivated, feeling frustrated, but then also moments of feeling very, very helpless. So that's what comes up for me. And then again, I'm going to stay quiet, and if anyone feels comfortable chiming in, you can definitely chime in.
I can go. Very, I think the term has a lot of emotion, and like you said, Zahra, both sides of that spectrum. So I feel, I feel like so many women have so much strength to survive it. I know that it exists, and it's infuriating that it continues, and that children are affected, that women are affected, and more recently I'm learning how perpetrators are even affected because of their own histories of trauma. So I also feel motivated. I think I've seen enough resilience and change to feel motivated that change is possible and things can get better with support.
Mm-hmm.
I feel a lot of different things. So sadness that it's so prevalent and that so many people don't have like the basic feeling of being safe in their homes, which every single one of us deserves to have. And I get angry that there is still so much denial around it, and oftentimes like blaming the person who's abused.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also feel very strongly and passionately that every single one of us can do something to make a difference, and just simply by like understanding what it is and recognizing the signs and speaking up against it, like we actually can make a difference. And I feel like that's really important for everyone to identify something that they can do to make a difference, and so then there's hope in that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, so then that's usually when I would like close up the circle and then kind of just talk about what domestic violence is, because even within, I think there's so many misconceptions about domestic violence and sexual violence and interpartner violence and all of that. And especially with young kids, I think there's a lot of, especially with social media and just like everything that's out there, they have access to so much information that sometimes it kind of turns into misinformation or like misinterpretation. And so either they like see that, oh, it may be happening, but like I don't really want to acknowledge it, or they kind of feel like they're the only ones and that's their normal and they feel embarrassed by it. So I think acknowledging like what domestic violence is, that it's a pattern of abusive behavior used by someone to establish power and control over another person. And I think that power and control dynamic is really, really crucial to the definition and also the pattern where it's like a recurring cycle of abuse. And there are multiple ways of abuse. Malahat, I know you mentioned a bunch of them in the beginning when we were going through the scenario. There's financial, spiritual, verbal, physical, emotional. And I think a lot of times, especially in the Muslim community, we're really unaware or kind of overlook the spiritual abuse of things. But I think that's a very crucial thing to acknowledge within a faith-based community. We're not the only ones that fall victim to the spiritual abuse. There are other communities as well, but just acknowledging that, interpretations can be taken. And a lot of times this is the reason, in my experience, what I've seen is that children start to, walk away from faith, and they see faith as a negative thing because their mother or father used it as a form of abuse. So they're like, how can, God want, X, Y, and Z to happen to me, or like have this to be in my life. So I think a lot of grace with kids, and, kind of listening to how they're still developing and they're still trying to understand their belonging in the world. And also just like going through the existential things, like how am I going to address these very real questions about, like, is there a God? Is there, like, why do we pray? Why is someone capable of using prayer or worship as a form of abuse? Like, what is all of that? So it's a lot of stuff. And then this just statistic is always striking to me, where according to the Childhood Violence Association, 5 million children witness domestic violence each year in the US. That's a lot of kids. And they all, grow up to be functioning, adults in society, and the way that they process those things are very, very different. When we're talking about childhood development, there's different stages. Again, this isn't an only theory. This is like one of the Erickson theories from psychology. But within each stage of psychosocial development, there's like checkpoints, right? So I'm not going to go into this intensively. Take this with a grain of salt. There are certain really great things from theories in psychology, and there's certain things that are kind of written in textbook, but it doesn't apply to every single child. And that's why I always say, kind of take theories and all of that with a grain of salt, because it functions differently for each child. But within infancy, you kind of develop this trust or mistrust in your relationships, because you're very reliant on your caretaker. You're either going to trust that your caretaker is going to be there for you, keep you safe, or you're not going to trust that because they weren't present. Early childhood, kind of, you're getting into more autonomy. So you're doing basic things. You don't need like a diaper anymore. You're starting to like get potty trained and all of that stuff. So you have more autonomy, or you have shame and doubt. So like either you met that checkpoint, or you are shamed or doubted for not doing things. So like wetting the bed is also one of them. Are you kind of, the way that you're consoled about it, is it comforting or is it more shameful? And kind of goes to a deeper root of the child. Preschool is when they start, developing a relationship with other children. And so there's kind of like an initiative. Do they take initiative, or do they kind of like step back and aren't as curious or aren't as willing to be assertive? School age kind of talks about your place in society a little more, and kind of their understanding of this belonging. So industry versus inferiority. Do they have this sort of idea of like, I am less than, or I'm a capable member within this group of people? Adolescence really focuses on identity, and between these two checkpoints, I feel like, again, this is my personal opinion, that like everything that built up, it's really seen within these three. So like within school age, adolescence, and then when they're young adults. And so within adolescence, that's when they start establishing their identity. They start identifying what's important to them. And that'll trickle into young adulthood, where they start forming relationships, romantic relationships. And the way that they see their place within these romantic relationships, it really is going to come down what they've witnessed throughout all of these stages beforehand. And again, if there are any questions, please stop me, and you can definitely ask me questions. For everybody that's watching this later, I'll share my information at the end, so that if you have any questions or concerns, you're more than welcome to reach out. Again, defining what trauma is and kind of the general trauma. Again, take this with a grain of salt. It's not textbook. Everybody processes trauma differently. Complex trauma is something that's repetitive. In general, trauma is defined as a psychological emotional response to a disturbing event in someone's life. And trauma has layers, right? Something that's disturbing and distressing for one person may not be their trauma for another person. So it's very variable depending on the individual. And then complicated grief, I always bring this up with trauma because when you have a sense of trauma, there is a sense of loss within it. So whenever I look at domestic violence, I really think about how the kids feel this like inherent loss of like two parents, right? A parental unit. They feel this loss of, their agency within that. They lose sight of like what is normal and what is not normal, what is a healthy relationship. And so that brings a lot of grief as well. And I think grief is processed differently throughout everyone's life. And so when a child is grieving, obviously their brain is functioning differently. And I really bring this up because to highlight that they are going through all of these emotions all at once, and that their way of processing the world changes. So complicated grief is like a persistent form of intense grief, in which maladaptive thoughts and dysfunctional behaviors are present. And right here, it specifically says memories of the person who died, but it can also be memories of, a happier time for the child, and now it's not a happier time, or something that they lost within the relationship with their mother or father. So I always bring this up intentionally. I really like Inside Out for these different things. I think it was such a great movie to kind of highlight all of these variable emotions. And, regulation of emotions are skewed when you're not processing emotions at a developmental stage and passing all of those checkpoints. So you have jealousy, anger, happiness, fear, love, excitement, sadness. All of these are general emotions that we all possess, but the way that someone loves may change. Their definition of what love is may change. Maybe they're constantly in fear. They don't feel safe. Sister Selma mentioned how like everybody deserves to be in a safe home. That's really important. But if you're fearing that safety, you're constantly in this sort of survival mode. Anger can come up a lot for especially teenagers when they're kind of going through a lot of things biologically as well, but they're also processing their emotions. So they're very angered by the way that their life is, and they have a lot of angst within that. Again, these are just theories that I, again, will say to take with a grain of salt. These are childhood attachments that form healthily. So you have secure attachments, which are, for example, with an infant, the infant, when the mother leaves or a loved one leaves, they start crying, they're unhappy, and they're happy when the mother comes back. Avoidant does not want to be with the mother when she does come back, and is very distracted by the environment. And ambivalent is very upset when mother leaves and does not interact with the environment a lot, and isn't easily consolable when you come back. These three attachments I always include just because I feel like it's really important if a child is going through trauma. They say that a child can even go through trauma when they're in the womb. And so children experience trauma very differently. And so these three, especially these two right here, if they don't have a healthy relationship with their caretaker, or they don't have a healthy relationship with their environment, then the way that they form attachments at a young age is going to be different. And this will translate into adulthood. So like the way that they form relationships with friendships or with romantic relationships with future spouses is going to vary. And I think I have that in one of the following slides. So the way that trauma impacts the brain, and this is where my research was focused on in grad school, is really like the developmental trauma. So what is most important to them? I don't believe it is a developmental delay. I think this is like my opinion, where, different people prioritize different things. And as humans, we're generally, you know, our key function in a primitive level is to survive and adapt. And that's what, you know, children do, where I have seen this all the time with kids that have faced through trauma. Their cognition, so the way that they process or learn within a classroom, is very different from those who have a typical development where they haven't gone through any trauma. So survival's the biggest thing within students that I have seen. That's their priority. Like, they're not going to focus on learning if they're focusing on being safe. And I always use this example. When I first started teaching, there was one child who we had a really great relationship. We said hello in the morning. He would stay after school. We would talk all the time. And one day I came into the classroom and I was wearing red. And I just remember distinctly it was a bright red color. And, you know, I said hi to him. He didn't say hi to me back. He avoided eye contact with me the whole class. And I was just so confused. I was like, you know, maybe he's just having a day. And but I distinctly like remember his body language and the way that he avoided looking me in the eye. And later on, I just, you know, I talked to him, talked to teachers, learned a lot about him through the year. And by the end of the year, or close to the end of the year, I realized that there was something in his life that the color red triggered him. So his survival mode, obviously, he saw me in red, right? And he wasn't going to learn in my classroom because to him, red was trigger. It was something that elicited a negative response. And that memory, which obviously in brain terms is the hippocampus, is responsible for memory. He just went to his survival mode and said that I want to avoid this color. I want to avoid seeing it. I want to avoid thinking about it. So I'm not going to learn today. And that is very fair. I think that's a very fair thing to have for a child. If they're not, you know, in survival mode, they're not in like feeling safe in a space, they're not going to learn. Survival mode and learning mode, like your brain switches and your priorities change. And again, like this is just an example of how per age, if violent behavior by parent towards other parent prenatally, you see the distress on the mother being translated to the child. So there's a low birth weight, there's premature birth, there's excessive bleeding upon giving birth. And this is a direct result of a physical trauma and emotional stress on the mother. So really the physicality translating into the well-being of the child. Infants are inconsolable, irritable, bedwetting, they have attachment issues. This is kind of what we talked about before. It's an important age for attachment. And so if they're not forming that parent caretaker attachments, they're going to present very irritable and inconsolable. In school age, obviously, this is when you start interacting with other kids. You start getting this sense of like, I look like this person looks like this is how we function differently. And this is when you have a heightened sense of their own emotions. So they're able to be like, if I'm crying, I'm sad. If I'm laughing, I'm happy. And there are learning impairments and a lot of times over assessment of learning disabilities because of trauma. I'm a learning specialist, so this is kind of something that hits home for me, where especially with like racial trauma and our country's systemic injustice within education, there's a lot of over policing of how students are assessed and tested for learning impairments. So a lot of kids historically and just generally speaking in people of color experience a lot more trauma than non-people of color. And so a lot of times this is the time where they are diagnosed with learning impairments due to this heightened stress response. You know, if you're taking an exam and you're not able to focus because a sound is triggering for you, you're not going to do well on that test. So that's something that like I can talk about for ages in the education system, but I'll spare you for that right now. And then adolescents, obviously they start using substances, they start risk taking because their prefrontal cortex isn't developed, so their judgment skills are not very developed, they start doing self-destructive behavior. So a lot of eating disorders rise up during this time. They can also, you know, put themselves into situations that are not ideal and get hurt by that. So, you know, adolescents are trying to take that agency and trying to be more present in their surroundings. But a lot of times, if they go through trauma, they're going to turn to different things for coping skills. And I've seen this a lot with different students: drinking, smoking weed, taking different forms of drugs, isolating themselves. This all happens with teenagers. And then triggering factors, these are just a few examples. Colors can be triggering, like the example that I gave with my student. Places or environment, coming from a teacher's perspective, a lot of times the classroom or the way desks are arranged or the way that a teacher's teaching can bring up a very triggering response. Words, that's why words matter. I feel like words can be very triggering for children. Religion, again, with spiritual abuse, a lot of children go through a lot of misunderstanding and that sort of processing of how religion fits into their life and how spirituality and how a God could do this. Community, you know, a lot of times community members who are not very understanding of domestic violence, and within a child's experience, there have been like uncles or aunties that have said like, blame the victim or anything like that. Communities can trigger that response. So maybe they just don't want to go to a specific gathering. Authority in general, especially for teenagers, if there is an authoritative figure like police officers, if they had like a police officer come in and handcuff their mom or dad, take them away, they're not going to have a like positive experience of that. And then gender, depending on who the perpetrator is, I think children either feel more comfortable with a male or a female, and so just generally speaking. And so if their perpetrator was their father, they may not feel comfortable with like a male teacher because of the history of the abuse. And again, effects that trickle into adulthood due to like the attachment issues is a perception of reality, what's real, what's not real. This wires their brain to expect danger. So you're constantly having this stress hormone that's being released, and then it triggers fight or flight. This is supposed to be flight, not right, or freeze responses. So the way that they process things, they're either going to run away from something, they're either going to address it head on, or they're just not going to know what to do. And again, I've mentioned a few of these before. This creates difficulty in trusting within their own relationships. Their kind of understanding of what a marriage is supposed to be is skewed. Sometimes I think Mallah mentioned this earlier, where with offenders and perpetrators, there's some sort of form of abuse that they've been through, and that causes them to kind of reiterate the cyclical nature of the abuse. And so all of these things kind of tie together in adulthood. What I want to do for the last few minutes, if we had a larger group, I would have put you into breakout rooms and kind of see what you came up with. But this is kind of like the action planning and moving forward. Like, how can we support our youth? How can youth support one another? How can they support themselves and receive help? So what I wanted to do was kind of brainstorm at a personal level, a community level, and at a professional level. So first is how to seek support at a personal level. So I'm just gonna leave this open, and if you feel like you have an idea of how a youth could seek support at a personal level, you can just unmute yourself and let me know. So we're just gonna take the next maybe 5 minutes. I know we're a little over time, but maybe the next 5 minutes just brainstorming ways that youth can seek support. So we'll start off with the personal level.
I can go. Maybe just start with reaching out to a teacher or counselor.
Great.
Even, I mean, I'm not sure how much of this is going on, but I think that certainly it could be a possibility is reaching out to their parents if there is a parent who they trust. And also I'm thinking spiritual
Mhm.
spiritual leaders or individuals in their own community.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that spiritual leaders, I would, ask them to also kind of bring about a way to find comfort. I think like comfort's the biggest thing. So kids have to feel comfortable going to someone. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about when, you seek support through community or give through a community. I think that's really important, the way that you shape your beliefs and kind of deliver your understanding of young people and kind of like are perceptive of their needs. I would also just say confiding in friends, I think can be a really great support for young people. I know it's not the most ideal because the kids are still developing and they're still understanding, but I think I truly believe that young people know the right thing to do, and if they confide in their friends and their friends see something that's coming up and they know someone to trust, they're going to bring it up, especially if it relates to their friends' safety. So confiding in friends, this can just be helpful emotionally for a kid. Like if they only trust one of their friends and they just want to tell them about it, I think it's really great that they have that support system. And again, for anybody at home, if you think of other things that we didn't think of, feel free to reach out to us and let us know. Does anybody else want to share anything about at a personal level?
I was just thinking that there are like crisis hotlines that people can reach out to, and most of them have chat features if you're not able to talk on the phone. And so I think that's a really good resource, especially if you identify or you're having trouble thinking about who in your family or that you know is trusted.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think going into how to seek support at a community level, I would say reaching out to spiritual leader here as well. Do you think that there's any other ways that youth can reach out at a community level, either for themselves or for someone that they know?
Some people have the option of joining like a peer support group.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes schools have them. Sometimes communities may have like a peer support group.
Yeah, I think a lot of I think it depends on like where you're residing, but I know that in New York, the Y is really great for young kids. It has either teachers or just like people that they go to. A lot of kids who are in the foster care system go to the Y a lot, and they have like an established place that they could either, shower in peace or just like wash their clothes in peace and all of that stuff. There are teachers like group leaders. There are, just friends there that can help out. And I think it depends on where you are, but even just like a Sunday school community, I think if you have a good Sunday school community with a teacher or with, an older person that they trust, I think that would be a really great thing too. Anything else?
I was just thinking the big brothers and sisters through the Y. I think it is through the Y, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then the other thought is mentors. And I've worked in New York too, and I remember that there were quite a few organizations, not even just from a community level, but businesses that also engage in mentorship with youth. I think they're really empowering to have an adult who is stable and kind and trustworthy.
Yeah, especially like this hits home for me in New York, just because there's so many kids in New York.
Yes.
And it's, they're all going through different things. They're all from different backgrounds. And so actually one of my other schools, they used to have the option for some kids to stay overnight at the school if they didn't feel comfortable going home. And I know that there are a few boarded schools like that in the city that offer the space to children that if they feel comfortable with the teachers in the building and the teachers are kind of like background checked and they feel safe, that they have that option of staying overnight, which is really great for kids that are either in the foster care system or they have their neighborhoods have gang involvement or anything like that, or even if their home doesn't feel safe, going back to domestic violence. Like I had a few kids that just didn't want to go home because they just didn't want to deal with everything that was going on. The last one I'm going to ask is at a professional level. The first thing that comes out is therapy or counseling services. Anything else at a professional level?
I mean, I know some people might even talk to their doctor, like, you're going to your, whatever, a pediatrician or a family physician. Any professional could be sort of an access point to other services, or even simply just validation and acknowledgement.
Yeah, for sure. I know that a lot of schools have social workers within the building. A lot of kids don't know about the social workers or who the social workers are, because they, kind of just deal with crisis intervention. But I think, if a child's watching this right now, a teenager or any young person, there are social workers in your building. So please go see social workers at school. And they do keep things confidential. And so this is a really great resource for just, even finding therapy services that maybe not at the school, but are free of cost or anything. Anything else? Okay. And again, anybody who's watching this later, if you do come up with things that we didn't think of, that would be really great if you just sent them along. And then I think this is something that I remind kids that is very important is we talked about how to seek support, but receiving support is very different. And it's a process. I think, support, especially like if you come from a household that isn't safe, you're going to receive support, and the perception of support is going to be a little bit skewed because the family that was supposed to support you hasn't always been supporting you for whatever reason. And so it is a process of like trust, and it's completely valid that it takes time feeling out if you can trust someone, and hold on to the relief you feel unloading. So even though if it's uncomfortable in the beginning, there is that space of unloading that does present with comfort afterwards that I think is really important for kids to know. And this, I'm not going to ask us to brainstorm. This will be saved for, the youth to identify how they want to receive support. I don't think it's my place to say anything more. And so hopefully when we do more of these webinars in the future, we'll have a few kids that come and let us know how they would like to be seen or find relief to receive support. So that kind of brings us to the end. I know that was a lot. It always is a lot. I feel very tired too. So that is how I'm feeling right now. But I just want you to kind of check in with yourself, everyone who did show up, or if you're watching this afterwards, just check in with yourself and, identify how you're feeling. Every feeling is valid. It's completely fine if you're feeling disgusted. Maybe I said something that disgusted you, or you're feeling, angry. That's completely fine. You're feeling content. That's completely fine. Just acknowledge that within yourself. And I just want to open it to any questions that the people who are here want to ask me before I give my information. No questions? Okay, I'm gonna put this up on the screen. This is my personal email. Feel free to contact me if you have any other questions or resources for me, or just things that you feel like I could learn from too, or feel like you have a child or know a child who needs support. I'm definitely here to kind of talk things through. And then this is just the information for Peaceful Families. Yeah.
Question, if it's not too late.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you find to be a helpful way to invite a kid to open up, or a student, or if you think that a young person might be going through something, what do you think what have you found to be a helpful way to make them feel safe enough to open up?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think I'm still learning through that. And because I feel so grateful in my job, because I meet a new batch of personalities every year. And so I kind of learn from those personalities about how different personalities open up. I think for me, consistency is key, and not rushing them through sharing something. So consistency in knowing their name as a teacher, knowing the name of your student is very, very important. Saying good morning to them every single day, or good afternoon, or whatever, and addressing them by their name is really important. Doing little things to establish a relationship, either by noticing that they were wearing like a shirt with, an artist on it, or they were wearing these shoes that you really liked, and you just say those little things like, oh, I really liked your shoes, or where'd you get that from? And like having all this discussion. I know like one kid I had, he was a really hard nut to crack. He just like did not acknowledge anything like that. And I really liked his jeans one day, and he really liked my jeans that one day. And so I was like, oh, I really like your jeans. And he's like, oh, thanks, they're thrifted. And then we just started talking about thrift shops. And after that, he just like became more comfortable. Once you start making those relationships, and I feel incredibly privileged because I see the kids every single day. But just acknowledging that if they're having a rough day, or like they're not themselves, being like, hey, like, are you okay? Like, are you feeling okay? Like, I just wanted to check up on you. And I think not rushing the child to tell you anything, but just they genuinely know when someone is there for them. That's like what I have seen, where if you give them space and time, don't, rush them into speaking to you, they're a lot more open. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's from my experience.
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, since we don't have any more questions, Zahra, I would like to take the opportunity on behalf of Peaceful Families to thank you so much for this detailed and wonderful presentation. And hopefully, there will be more of that with more details and more participants. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everybody who joined us despite the small number. I would like to end up by saying that at the Peaceful Families Project, we offer a variety of different programming, and then 70% of our programming and almost all of our resources are provided free for the communities. Your generous contribution helps us maintain the ability to continue to provide free programming to those that need it the most. Please contribute online through our website or through one of our other platforms, PayPal giving, Facebook, or via check. Visit our website at www.peacefulfamilies.org/donate. Thank you so much, everyone. And with that, I would like to end the webinar and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Take care, Sonia.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Take care.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum
It's really great, mashallah.
Thank you.